What makes you happy?
Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismail, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. In this episode, I talk to Iacopo Gronchi about transformative governance and collaborative movements. Iacopo is a PhD student at University College London Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Besides his PhD, Iacopo works as an expert in transformative governance at Demos Helsinki, a non-profit independent think tank. In this episode, we talk about societal transformation. We discuss theory and practice if it comes to making a difference, and you will hear about academia and consulting. You will understand what transformative governance means and what mission-oriented policy has to do with it. We discuss the importance and challenge of finding cross-border solutions, especially in turbulent times like ours. We talk about democracy and citizenship and why the key for change are collective movements. You will hear about problems of the current consulting industry and how we can turn things around in order to create a more prosperous future for all of us. Finally, we discuss the role of art in all of that. And with that, Iacopo, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
I'm very curious, and thank you for having me in the first place. That's also another feeling I have, thankfulness. It's beautiful to be here and share a little bit of what drives me, my research, my work, and very happy also to get to know you. That's what is on my mind as well, I will say.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that. And you have already mentioned your research and your work, and maybe we can start off giving a little bit of context. And the question I had, Iacopo, is we're going to talk about societal transformation a fair bit today. And maybe you want to help our listeners a little bit. Since when is that an important passion for you, but also your profession in a way?
Well, I think I got on top of that more or less 2.5 years ago, when I started a new professional adventure, but also human adventure, I would say, in a small think tank based in Helsinki, that is called the Demos Helsinki, which is a very peculiar think tank. Standard think tanks focus on providing information, advice, and sometimes consulting services, either to their home organizations, be them party or foundations, or to external actors and stakeholders. And Demos Helsinki is quite peculiar in that it is completely independent. And for this reason, it sets its own agenda, an agenda that is indeed motivated by an ethos for societal transformation, and societal transformation with certain characteristics, with characteristics that in a way reflect what we want to see happen in the world in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years to the long term. Given manifold challenges that we might address right now, such as faltering governance systems, climate collapse, economic systems that don't serve any more societal purpose, or that do so only with huge drawbacks. And basically getting in there was, for me, the first opportunity, I guess, to basically understand that they could, in a way, pay my own dues to this movement, to the purpose of changing things for the better, and trying also to understand what it means to do so by working with very different stakeholders, ranging from governments to private companies to foundations to citizens in practice. And that was quite eye-opening for me. And I guess that's also what drove me, not only, of course, to keep working with Demos in the first place, but also to try to tap into my academic interests in a way that was conducive to the further elaboration, thinking, and action of societal transformation in one way or another, be that through research, be that through consulting or any other way. And this is still very much at the bedrock of what I'm doing right now. And I gotta say, it feels quite fun and good.
Wonderful. Thank you for elaborating on that. And the slogan of Demos, I suppose, is only together can we fight for a fair, sustainable, and joyful next era. And you talked a little bit about that already, or to that already, but why do you resonate so much with that mission or vision?
Well, I will say that I came to that through the realization that basically the systems I was inhabiting from a professional or educational perspective were not driven by an explicit agenda in that respect. And I found it increasingly hard in a way to come to terms with the gap between those institutional premises and the urgent need to address many of the challenges that we basically talk every day with our friends, with our families, with our colleagues, and that we also see, of course, in the media and elsewhere, and that somehow increasingly also have a very strong impact on our own societies. In a way, I felt that especially working in an academic setting before getting to Demos and before coming back to it, this gap was embedded somehow into the incentives that were also driving people careers, so to speak, in that structure. And I wasn't very happy with it, to be honest. I am a curious person. I like, in a way, to indulge into intellectual debates, but despite being very leaning towards the theoretical sides of things, I feel that in the end, also, our own reflections should be conducive to action. And to do so, it takes a different mindset. Well, this pays like dues again to the title of your podcast as well, involuntarily, but it is true, in my opinion. And this is how I eventually started to looking for other incentives, so to speak, structures or working places that could allow me, in a way, not only to indulge into those fascinating conversations about the future of our societies, but also try to put this future into motion and to steer it to a degree in an era where we don't see much steering capacity at the collective level. And Demos Helsinki is one of the few organizations, I believe, but also my department at UCL is one of the few that has accepted the challenge of taking ownership of doing so. Of course, with all the humility that this entails, of course, but with a strong vision for doing that. So that's why the agenda resonates with me. And it's something that is born, of course, out of experience, out of a negative realization of what exactly can drive or cannot drive one's own career, and how those propositions are pursued in different places, I would say.
Absolutely. And Iacopo, you already talked a little bit about theory and practice, and you talked about academia, and you talked about your work at the very think tank Demos Helsinki. And maybe you can talk a little bit to the limitations, but also the benefits of either, or maybe even one after another, academia and putting things into practice, working with business leaders and on a consultant arm, let's just say.
Absolutely, yes. Well, first of all, my argument on academia is focused on social sciences, of course, which is my field of domain. I was educated in a pretty conventional department focusing on political sciences, a bit of economics, most importantly, political economy. So how those two words interact with each other. And working very closely with leading scholars in the field, I realized that somehow tenure tracks or career development pathways are very much based on incentives that can or cannot be conducive to the societal relevance of what these topics are actually talking about. And on the one hand, it is important in a way that academia and the social sciences branch of academia retains its own distinctiveness and room to explore fundamental issues. I'm not at all against theory or not even theoretical ways to look at practice. But I found myself, and this is only my opinion, it's not something that in a way I feel should be different for people that feel differently, increasingly at odds with the idea that the theoretical elaboration and interpretation of practical developments in society could be completely detached from the way in which we engage in society. Somehow it feels like you might end up pursuing a brilliant academic career, very specific research tribes that cater about micro issues that might be very interesting, but that sometimes can also be very self-referential. And that, this is something also that gets not only embedded into the outputs of research, but it also becomes socialized. It becomes in the way you interact in the workplace, and becomes embedded in the way excitement arises, is leveraged or disengaged within an organization. And I didn't feel that was for me, basically. And I'm still not, in a way, completely disillusioned with respect to the idea that academia itself can change and become more aware of these concerns. And certainly, again, there must be division of labor in this. Not everyone can, in a way, realize to be a political actor, even if in the end, every academic department bears political responsibility, not only because they do, in a way, engage with societal issues that might be equality and inclusivity in their own structures, or the way they publicly procure services that are more or less sustainable, but also because of what they do goes at the very core of the problems that we are challenging today. And in a way, first going through Demos and then going through UCL in this new department allowed me in a way to explore exactly how to bring back purpose within this kind of intellectual work. This is for what concerns academia or academic work, which I might pursue in one institution or the other, including Demos Helsinki. But certainly there is also a whole question about consulting itself, which is maybe closer to what I do at Demos, and it has completely different problems. This will take me a little bit further ahead, but maybe I can indulge on it. Also because there's a new book that's actually just coming out, written by two colleagues of mine, namely the director of my institute and one PhD student that's also working with me, exactly on the problems faced by the consulting industry these days. This book, written by Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington, it's called The Big Con, with a subtitle that goes such as How the Consulting Industry Weakens Our Businesses, Infantilizes Our Governments, and Warps Our Economies. And while, of course, seems kind of very aggressive towards the industry as a whole, it actually portrays, the book itself is not a plea against consulting. And I would be a little bit self-harming if I would make a case against consulting in its entirety, being a consultant myself in the first place. But it's about, again, the institutional incentives that shape the industry, or maybe the loss of purpose that characterized the evolution of the industry in the last 20 to 30 years. And we might want to go deeper later on, maybe, on what exactly we are talking about when that. But there is a new book coming out, and maybe we can also explore that later. Who knows?
No, absolutely. That sounds fascinating. And as you said, you are a consultant yourself. I have been a consultant for quite some time, and the umbrella term consulting is huge, but I would be very interested in understanding what are actually the challenges, the difficulties, or the downsides of the consulting industry that we have created. But before we go there, I have a few follow-up questions. When you talked about academia or education and some changes that you would envision, and I know it's a somewhat loaded question, but what things come to mind if you would be able, or which changes would you like to see in more traditional education is question number one. And maybe question number two, but maybe you can combine them. Are there good examples that come to mind, either in your very own institute or on other universities, different countries, different approaches? So which changes would you like to see? And do you have any examples you want to share with us?
Absolutely. And with the caveat that maybe I can talk a little bit more specifically of tertiary education, so university. Traditionally, not to say that in a way primary and secondary education are not relevant. Of course, they're extremely relevant, if not even more. But this is exactly what I'm experiencing myself in the first place a little bit more closely. And in this respect, again, speaking with reference to the social sciences, I believe that while, again, it is important to foster as diverse as possible ways to explore and tackle these challenges, there should be pathways for students in a way to engage firsthand with the resolution of collective problems, which entails two things. First, basically conceiving curricula in a way that engages with the actuality, and not only with the actuality, but how do we play a part into that? Secondly, basically providing the mechanisms or the cooperation tools in a way to allow university students, faculties, departments, professors themselves to basically be part of this change. So engaging with policymakers, be them at the national, international, or local level, engaging with private companies as well, engaging with the foundations. This thing already happens. Of course, there is a lot of funding within European countries and beyond at the international level with the European Commission that creates those pathways in a way to engage. But those are very much limited to the upper echelon of the education system, basically to those that are already. Secondly, they're also very much focused on research outputs that do not necessarily translate into practical changes for society, or that speak actually to the policymaker, which is something that, for example, most regularly consulting is capable of doing. So in a way, there is a sweet spot between the ability of knowledge in a way to critically challenge the ways we look at things in our societies and the ability to put them in motion. Research and consulting so far have been quite separated in how they deal with those two problems, basically defining, we could say, a very clear division of labor. But I feel with the fact that those challenges are so overwhelming and so complex that no one has really nailed out how to tackle them, not last our governments, let alone our corporations. There is an increased call also for those societal actors that not necessarily have engaged with processes that we can right away define political, may I dare, to reflect on those and take a stance. And this is also where the two ends, in a way, are kind of confluating into each other, rejoining. Research becoming slightly more open into engaging with those stakeholders, consulting itself in places like Demos, for example, being more and more aware of research-based developments, exactly because also research has the power in a way to redefine how we look at things. And solutions provided by the consulting industry in the last 20, 30 years didn't work out that much, which means that maybe we have to take a step back and rethink a little bit more radically and fundamentally how we do provide this advice to governments, corporations, and so forth. Which leads me maybe to a couple of examples. Of course, Demos and UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is the place that I work at, are example of that. And maybe I can focus a little bit on the latter because it provides an idea exactly of the academic institution, as you asked, that in a way embodies this kind of overarching shift. UCL IIPP, the acronym of the institute I just mentioned, was founded just 5 years ago, but very rapidly set up at least three main areas of action. One being peer research, where I'm basically also focused upon with my PhD. One devoted to teaching, with a master in public administration that engages with civil servants, management consultants, citizens from all corners of the world that come here in a way to elaborate after some years in their own industries on the new frameworks and the groundbreaking research that is done by some of my colleagues, and then go back after an intense 1 year experience to their job to start implementing them into practice. And finally, there is a third branch, which is an emerging one called Policy Studio, where most of the research, also in partnership with some of the students working in the Master of Public Administration, engage actively with a network of organizations that is interested into applying some of the concepts that we are developing through our research in the Institute. Therefore, in a way, bridging the gap between theory and practice, practitioners and researchers, and basically making sure that we get the most of the emerging evidence from that and upend the theory in itself based on the evidence on the ground. And this is done by involving, as you can see, many different stakeholders. It's not only an ivory tower affair. It's about taking the practitioners from local governments in Brazil, Canada, or Japan, for example, bringing them in London, co-creating them together, new ideas, and then, of course, making sure that there is a strong network motivated by common purpose about how to envision change within organizations. They can report back, elaborate independently, so to speak. Basically doing that by means also the research that we try to pursue. And that's a good example, but it's not the only one. Another good example that comes to mind is an institute based in the Erasmus University of Rotterdam called Drift, which is basically a policy lab, again, trying to reshape existing curricula within the standard bachelor and master courses in the Erasmus University to basically bring frameworks that concern societal transformations, sustainability transitions, and most importantly, how to empower students to be part of those changes into their curricula. And at the same time, bridging the gap between traditional research and consulting. So I guess that while those are just early signs of change, this is something that goes beyond the single cases. It's becoming part of a movement that builds maybe on the idea of third mission that gradually took hold in many parts of Europe during the last 20 years in European universities. But that eventually builds exactly on that awareness that we can't just ignore those problems, and we need to engage with them in order to become meaningful actors of the social political dynamics that we inhabit, and at the same time basically make the most of what we do in our everyday work across different industries and structures, which is to me beautiful because it feels like bringing back again purpose beyond institutional incentives in both of these institutions.
No, absolutely. And I think you mentioned a few very important factors, and that is this co-creation and being part of change while working on those new frameworks in theory, but then also putting them into practice. So I think that makes very good sense. Iacopo, you mentioned your PhD, and it reads Chasing the Hiding Hand, Essays on Transformative Governance. My question would be, what is transformative governance for you?
Well, I could talk, of course, endlessly about it, but I'll try to be concise in saying that this very early title draft of my PhD research focuses on transformative governance as the process of steering collective action towards ambitious long-term social-technical challenges. Social-technical challenges that can be identified exactly in light of their uncertainty that surrounds them. Uncertainty that can be defined because ends and means of basically what do we want to achieve in detail and how do we get there when we speak, for example, of industrial transformation or the adoption at a broader scale of circular economy, governance models can mean in practice. In most cases, we are demanded to take action right now for challenges that are as urgent as climate change, with no clear view of what exactly the outcome of this process of finding out new solution will look like in practice. Who will be the winners and the losers of the process? How do we manage the transition? How do we make sure that, in a way, we can create exactly that fair, sustainable, and joyful next era that we also speak about at Demos, for example, while at the same time going through fierce disruptions, because those are the ones that we face, be that because of climate collapse or because of dramatic societal change in the way our mobility systems works, in the way our food systems are engineered and designed, so to speak. And I could go forward, but I hope this provides a little bit of examples of what it entails in practice. Then the word of governance itself maybe deserves a little bit more of explanation. I'm not speaking necessarily about transformative government, but about transformative governance, because the premise is that meaningful societal transformation arises from collective action, which can be steered and influenced by government, but it does not end up within the scope of government policies. If we think about these challenges themselves, such as, for example, the adoption of a circular economy, production and consumption model, those solutions won't necessarily come from government itself. Namely because government is not operating society as a whole. Businesses, citizens, foundations, civil society associations, and all sorts of different stakeholders do play their own distinctive role. They exert agency individually and collectively into shaping those systems. And government, in my view, and at least in the way I aim to explore through my research, can be a platform for involving those different stakeholders into making sense exactly of those transformations, experimenting together how to get through those changes that have very meaningful and potentially dramatic outcomes on the lives and business models and organizational incentives of those different actors. Not because the government has the solution, but because the government is especially, or most notably, I would say, in Western liberal democracies, such as the one that we inhabit in Europe, the most accountable actor for doing so. It is basically founded on democratic legitimacy, and there are maybe different ways to make sure that problems to be explored, but this is just one facet of the coin. It is the actor that funnels our own economic potential by collecting revenues and channeling them also through that to invest in better systems in the future. And of course, can also become the platform where we come to make sense of what is happening once we try to embark on societal transformation, once we try to disrupt and to innovate those systems in order to understand what are the best ways forward. Making sure that that again is in line with the preferences, ambitions, hopes, and desires of citizens themselves. So again, we start from government, but only as a means, as a vehicle in a way, to foster collective action and to reorient it, which is the effort ultimately of many different actors, which again calls back the need of having universities that are engaged, the need to have consulting industries that are aware of the fact that they not only provide technical advice, but they do provide politically sensitive technical advice with respect to how they suggest ways to tackle these challenges in the first place.
And I think it's a very important distinction you make. I would like to talk with you later on about democracy and participation and exactly about those collaborative or collective changes that we need to make, but that governance is so much bigger than only government, because we have citizens, we have businesses, and we have so many different stakeholders. But maybe for the time being, we can stick with the government for a few minutes. And one term which I have found a couple of times that you talk about is mission-oriented innovation policy. What do you understand MOIP to be?
Yep. This requires a little bit of background because it is not something that I come up with just on my own. Basically, the background of missions or mission-oriented innovation policy, but we can ditch the word innovation. To me, it's a little bit demeaning, even if I use it myself. Let's talk mission-oriented policy. Is basically a rationale for doing policy, be them related to innovation, technological or social innovation, or even to welfare, for example, or to health, that basically puts at the core the idea that different initiatives and instruments used by government can be steered synergistically to address complex challenges that we do not have yet solutions for. So in this respect, missions are exactly those hopefully democratically chosen societal challenges that we decided to tackle by embarking on examples of collaborative experimentation, processes that we don't know the outcome of yet, but that we need in a way to tackle because our society is demanded in the first place, which again fits back into most prominently climate change, but not only that. So in technical terms, again, mission-oriented policy has been defined as a coordinated package of initiatives that exactly tries to scope how to address these challenges and involves stakeholders into doing so, usually in a long time frame. So basically even beyond single electoral cycles. But to me, it also gets a little bit deeper than that. And that's also why I spoke elsewhere of missions as governance. It entails basically a different way of thinking about how the government operates. And here the shift is exactly hinting at the shift towards a more collaborative state that very much you were pointing at also in your question. We tend to think of government as something that in a way delegates with a clear perception of common good, as if we, the citizenship, had a clear idea of what that is, which often is not the case, and which then neutrally in a way, or based on the political preferences of the government rule at a certain moment in time, just translates those preferences into concrete action on the ground, or even most likely to do so. But actually, when it comes exactly to challenges that are facing this uncertainty, and for which governments, regardless of what color, usually do not have specific answer to tackle, a different way to look at it is exactly to look at it as a platform that in a way can be used exactly to scope together what are the best ways forward. So if we want to tackle climate change in the first place, or decarbonize agriculture, for example, there are two different ways to look at it. One, maybe slightly more conventional ways that entail figuring out a world where citizens, or most notably agricultural industry stakeholders and even lobbies, not even in a negative exception, but just in a neutral exception, know exactly how to address these problems. They convey that to government, and government just operates it, filters it with different trade-offs that might be due to political sensitivities or different concerns, and then translates it into the administration that then neutrally transforms it into action on the ground. Or we can look at it in another way, also because maybe I will indulge on that slightly after. Government doesn't work exactly in that way at all. Most notably because there is no clear conception of common good, for example, in the context of decarbonizing agriculture. There is no clear way to make sense of different political preferences in an objective way. And there is no clear way to operate those goals, even if we had the clear mandates and an exact definition of what we want to achieve, because the administration is figuring out on the ground. So exactly because of these flows, we can look also at government in a different way. We can look at it as the black box that we also could try to open and make a little bit more clear to citizens themselves, where those solutions or those objectives are figured out iteratively, where in a way the debate is not focused anymore on pre-settled politically defined preferences that are deposited every X years, depending on your democracy, but where this sort of deliberation and continuous discovery of more specific ends and more apt means is actually continuous. And this is something that in a way is already slightly happening. That's the thrilling fact that I also aim to research in some countries. Maybe it's not happening at the forefront of the political debate, but when you look at the most recent trends in industrial and innovation policy and how governments are trying to engage with industry stakeholders, civil society actors, research itself, academia, you do look that those long-term strategies are increasingly supported by deliberative processes that are based on the development of a mutual understanding of what these challenges are, on the definition of portfolios of projects that try out different solutions, and that in a way are leveraged as concrete experimentation on the ground to understand exactly how best to tackle it. And maybe we are not good yet at all, or those governments that are still breaking ground in this respect haven't yet figured out exactly how to make the most of the learnings that emerge from that experimentation, or how to make sure that those experiments are actually linked to the democratic debate in a more visible way, so that we can also ensure that those long-term strategies can also be empowered by long-term political thinking rather than the narrow frame of political mandates. But certainly things are moving on the ground because the challenges that we're facing in a way demand it. And this is exactly what mission-oriented policy, in my opinion, is about. Not because it is strictly defined in that terms by the academic debate, but because I'm deliberately looking at that from a distinctive perspective that I'm trying in a way through my research, both to argument theoretically, but also to detect empirically in those case studies.
Thank you very much, Iacopo. And I have a couple of thoughts that come to mind when you talk about governance and different governments. And you are born, raised, and mostly educated in Italy. And now you're based in the UK. And you've mentioned the challenges of our times a couple of times during our conversation. And we discussed long-term, we talk about industrial, we talk about innovation policy. To which extent, or what are your thoughts on collective actions that also go cross-border? Is this something that's happening? Is this something that's necessary? How do we make sure that Italy is not pursuing very different policy than the UK, than Germany, than the US, than, I don't know if we want to open the whole geopolitical spectrum here, but I think you get the point where I'm reaching at.
Absolutely. Well, you're touching on a very relevant and very challenging point. Yes, it is crucial to think about cross-border innovation, not only because innovation can happen beyond the boundaries of national states or different geopolitical blocks, but also because most of the challenges that we have ahead, again, climate change, are global in nature. And they won't be solved, not necessarily because we don't innovate, but because we do need a way to build on each other's knowledge, advancements, learnings, and discoveries in order to make sure that we are able to get define the targets on time, for example, with respect to this challenge. And unfortunately, what's happening right now is that we have an increasing amount of cross-border innovation and collaboration within the European space, most notably because most European research universities are co-opted into research and innovation frameworks defined by the European Commission that enable the formation of very rich consortia that try to tackle this challenge in a pan-European way. But we are not seeing that happen, of course, at the broader geopolitical scale. Actually, what we're seeing right now in these very last days, is that the last few years of geopolitical tension between the US and China are actually becoming heightened rather than narrowing down, and this is quite dramatic in view of the thing that of the challenge that we're trying to tackle and our odds towards making it. Let alone the broader question, of course, of Russia, which is in itself, if we think about it, interconnected to this whole climate change challenge. Because if we truly want to move beyond fossil fuel, then Russia is a big problem. So just putting it that little drop into perspective to figure out how this is not only about geopolitics, but about a very specific social, political, and technical phasing, where someone call it a second deep transition. We are trying exactly to move beyond the shape of industries that very much defined the shape of global politics for the last 100 years. And those actors are very much aware of it. So that's for what it takes to those actors. But maybe to provide also a positive example of how cross-border innovation and collaboration can be so decisive for our future. There is a fantastic book written by Professor Charles Sable and Professor David Victor, the former teaching at Columbia University and being a very close professor to very close friend of Demos Helsinki, that exactly, it's called Fixing the Climate, and exactly contrasts the development of the Montreal Protocol in 1987 against the use of ozone depleting substances with the development of the Kyoto Agreement in 1997. Basically, underpinning and trying to detect what worked in 1987 and the following years with ozone depleting substances that we were able to successfully reduce to a minimum, thus saving the ozone hole from depletion. That didn't happen in Kyoto with the cutting off of global greenhouse gas emissions that still haunt us up to nowadays, with the Paris Agreement being largely unfulfilled. What they detect is exactly a loose framework of governance that was devised by several organizations within the United Nations ecosystem that were capable of organizing exactly the sort of collaborative experimentation based on the definition of a clear-cut mission, in this case, the reduction of ozone depleting substances in several industries, in an open-ended way. So basically, devising a framework and funding mechanism, but also reporting mechanisms that could ensure that experimentation done across the globe by several networks of stakeholders across different industries could be conducive to the eventual success of the mission in itself. And I won't indulge into the details of what is exactly the governance structure that underpinned that model, but that proved quite decisive because we managed to get the goal. And we managed to get there at a global scale, despite the fact that these completely reshuffled the shape and structure of industry sectors and global supply chains that also had global repercussions that entailed winners and losers across different sides of the globe. This didn't happen with Kyoto. Hopefully, likely because the interests are much greater. We're not just talking about one specific polluting substance, but about the very basic backbone of our energy ecosystems, as well as many other industrial sectors. And the outcome of that process, which is now translated and fed into the Paris Agreement, seems to be even slightly less probable against the Montreal Protocol, given exactly the geopolitical tensions that we're facing nowadays, which is very disheartening, but not at all an excuse for inaction, I believe, because still many positive developments, for example, within Europe are happening, while there are tensions about how industrial subsidies and investments with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and the European New Deal in Europe are causing further dilemmas. In the end, there is actually scope for win-win solutions, I believe. So those tensions need to be managed because they're embedded in our global political economy, but they're not unbearable. They're not doomed, so to speak. And getting to the level where we're able, in a way, to bring exactly this idea of mission-oriented governance or mission-oriented policy, not only within nation states or at the European level, as it is already happening, but at a global scale, very much in the way we already did in 1987, even if we didn't label that mission-oriented policy, that will be quite critical and something that many people, not only at my institute, but also in other organizations are working towards.
Let's talk a little bit about theory and practice when we mention those mission-oriented policy. And I want to quote from an article of yours, and it says, this year, being 2022, mission-oriented innovation policy practitioners from 40 plus OECD countries were asked to define their challenges. Of them, only 1 in 4 had a defined target. Fewer than 1 in 6 had a dedicated structure for its governance, and only 1 in 10 had developed a plan and process for its monitoring. So Iacopo, can you share with us why so many governments seem to have difficulties implementing or even properly defining those necessary changes?
Yeah, that is exactly where I try to hone in on with my PhD. So I'm very interested and thankful for that question. A working hypothesis there is that our government structures, processes, and institutions are slightly unfit for our times. for tackling these challenges, to which mission-oriented policy provides a way to think about, but not definitely the solution for how to do so in practice, which is quite ironical. We have this beautiful narrative about mission-oriented policy, something that during the last 10 years fostered an enormous amount of political demand within Europe and beyond, and that led many governments to rethink the way they do and conceive industrial and innovation policy. But our governments are not designed to do that right away somehow. And the reason for why this is so is that, first of all, in the last 30 years, they didn't pay attention to build the right structures, processes, and institutions, which otherwise can also be said in terms of capacities and capabilities. Something that very much boils down to the way those organizations are shaped, the people they recruit, the way they channel their processes beyond governmental silos, so that if we want to pursue a cross-cutting climate adaptation strategy, we don't need to deal with political infights across different ministerial silos, environment litigating with infrastructure, and all trying to report back to a Ministry of Economy, which is found in the neutral task of trying to please that or the other political interest, but we can try to work and to make government work in a more synergistic way. This is not in itself a fault of governments or, for example, of bureaucracy, this kind of a very interesting word that usually comes with absolutely negative connotations, but it is actually crucial to the way our governments are able to deliver to us what sustain a good life in our places. But it certainly boils down to how those bureaucracies or government structures adapt over time to meet these challenges. And the point is that the theory and the practice based on slightly flawed theory that shaped the debate in the last 30 years was very much based on the premise that government was needed only to a minimum account, and that most of the solutions could be outsourced, basically in a framework defined by government, but ultimately supplied and managed by private actors, which is not necessarily a negative thing. I'm not saying that, and even the people that are in a way contrasting the trend in the debate during the last 30 years are not necessarily against the involvement of private sector at all. I just made a case that we need more collaboration among the public, the private sector, and the citizenship at large. But the point is the nature of this. By doing so, and this trend has a name called the new public management, basically governments not only outsource the way they provide services, but also the way they look, think, strategize, and how they're able to provide those services. And by doing so, they basically cut their own ability to tackle those challenges. The first example of it all, COVID-19. COVID-19 was basically the harbinger of many foreseeable societal disruptions that call for a government that is capable to react swiftly and in new ways, besides exactly those silos, besides those siloed budgets, personnel, and also skills that in a way might or might not be conducive to a more adaptive approach towards tackling societal challenges and designing policy that is able to do so. And at the same time prompted the search for new skills, capabilities, and routines. So in a way, our governments eventually, even if they took time and sensitivities about that, and the capability of our governments to deal with COVID-19 may vary from context to context, but eventually we managed to put this pandemic back to its own place. The risks are not ended up, but certainly this prompted a call for rescue to governments in order to be prepared for the next one, as well as for the many other crises that we are just touching upon. And in this respect, the practice of public sector innovation, so innovation within public sector ways of working, structures, and so forth, is not completely devoid of alternatives. Actually, civil servants themselves, during the last 20, 30 years, have been already experimenting with new things, new ways of working, new solutions to conceive how we do budget, how do we provide public services, how do we engage citizens in the co-creation of public services, or industry stakeholders in the implementation of industrial strategies, so to speak. The point is that this has happened a little bit in plain hidden and at the same time in plain sight. And no narrative, no compelling narrative, nor final word on what is the actual shape and structure of a government that is able to cope with these challenges has emerged so far. There are ideas, there are lots of opportunities, but exactly the kind of institutional innovation that we're seeing right up nowadays, with the development of these new long-term strategies that I was hinting at a few minutes ago, is exactly the sign that things are changing again. And in a way, the work that we're trying to do, both in research and consulting across these two organizations, Nemos Helsinki and UCL IAPP, is exactly, at least on my end, focusing on what are the best heuristics, policy tools, and capabilities that we can bring about in government, provide civil servants with, in order exactly to redesign the way government works, not to demolish it, because we do need bureaucracy, we do need stability, we do need a strong rule of law, we need predictable public action, but at the same time, we need a lot of flexibility. We need innovation also in government too. And that's exactly what we are trying to do.
I have a couple of follow-up questions, and I would like to use that as somewhat of a segue. And we talk about governance and governments as something fairly abstract. And I would love to hear your opinion or your thoughts when we talk about citizenship and when we talk about collaboration and when we talk about democracy. What are your thoughts on the current state of democracy? I will open up with the European Union. If you want to take it to any country in particular, be my guest to do so. But do you have concerns about democracy in the European Union? And do you also have hopes where towards it could lead us, and why it is in fact a collective transformation and not something that the abstract government is telling each and everyone to do, because we're all citizens?
Absolutely. Yes. This is a very complex question, and I'm definitely not the most competent person on that, but I can certainly share my perspective on that. To bridge from what we were discussing before, there is an increasing awareness that challenges such as climate change won't only be solved by technological hacks. Those technologies are first and foremost used by citizens, and the ways they interact within those production and consumption structures that we inhabit play a critical role into being part of those transformations. So we can't just neglect their own agency, nor pretend that we can impose those transformations from the top down. Or at least I would say that that's not the best way to ensure that those transformations are legitimate, most importantly, conducive to the common good for how we collectively decide upon it. And therefore, we need to find ways in a way to reignite participation and make sure that this is somehow empowering for our governments and for our collectivities, so to speak, for governance in terms of collective action to tackle them effectively. Now, as I was pointing out before, I'm slightly disillusioned that the recent trends in several European countries are conducive to exactly this outcome. And I'm not disillusioned against the representative democracy at all. I feel representative democracy is the bulwark for making those democratic transformations happen legitimately. But certainly something has been going wrong in the political discourse in the last 20 years. And the increasing amount of polarization that we see in society based on economic grounds or cultural grounds is the sign that we are unable in a way to provide solutions to the challenges of our times. And the fact that we keep in a way floating, or especially to make the example of Italy, within recurrent waves of shifting consensus between parties that increasingly, or at least in more unstable democracies such as Italy, lasted the span of only a few years, at the same time starting anew with those challenges that only get worse and worse, and our collective institutions being unable to even start providing solutions to address them, is flawed against the very possibility of tackling them effectively. And of course, polarization cannot be contested as such because it is, again, a sign. But the very problem arises when polarization makes impossible to provide a common ground for deliberation. And this is exactly the thing that scares me the most. I'm not sure exactly what are the trends or what would be the tendency for the next 5 years, 10 years in Europe or in Northern America or in Latin America. We see, I guess, contrasting signs, so to speak. And these, in a way, have manifold implications. On the one hand, in a way, there is the polarization in itself, and the discontent with certain forms of politics is the sign that we need to find new solutions. So the search for new solutions is defined in itself as something that I believe is important for our problems. But at the same time, we need, in a way, to make sure that we can overcome those dichotomies that, in a way, impede us to have long-term action and to find out together solutions that can be certainly politically sensitive, but ultimately negotiable between the winners, the emerging winners and losers of these transitions, in a way that is peaceful and not violent. Again, what would it take, in a way, to have less polarized politics and one that is most deliberated on principles that are grounded in the common recognition that we have shared challenges that we need to solve, that unites us more than the things that divide us, is very difficult. And on the one hand, I see very positively the fact that there is increasing agency within society to put societal issues top of the agenda. Let's look at the movement of Fridays for Future, for example. That's the positive sign of a growing part of society that usually felt relatively secluded from politics, youngsters basically, into action. And that's a very positive development for me. It is the sign that there is a political conscience. And even if this is not necessarily reflected into the way parties, for example, collect the demands of citizens, it is a sign that there is democratic vitality. And this needs to be cherished. At the same time, going from the societal level to the meso level of parties as mediators of these relationships between citizenships and governments themselves, certainly they need to do most of the work because that's exactly what is being faltering. Sometimes we see either the lack of long-term visions or the overfocus on challenges that are very much defined by dichotomic political contentions between a ruling party and an opposition party that are much more focused on nitty-gritty daily challenges that do not relate at all with the actual challenges that we have ahead. And those are very detrimental because I guess they disengage us because we can see the blatant value of them. They don't talk to our everyday problems. And at the same time, they also put our attention away from the actual challenges that unite us as well, and that we need long-term thinking to face. So the way parties, in a way, I could go longer, for example, with respect to the Italian case, because that's what I know best, about the problems that characterize how parties are structured, how they connect to civil society or do not connect, how they select the best and the brightest in a way to basically make sense of those collective demands. And it would be a story in Italy, it would be a story in France, another in Germany, and so forth. But certainly that is key. That is exactly the key challenge. Finally, if we move from citizens and parties to governments themselves, this is completely different in terms of focus, because again, it goes back to the idea of government structures that empower us to collaborate at a very practical level that not only relates to how we cast a vote and how we deliberate, also for means that are not only representative, but also deliberative and so forth, but also how we do that continuously once we put policies on the ground, once we basically embark on the experimentation that enables us to discover exactly what is entailed by the ends that we want to pursue collectively and what are the best means to achieve that. And in my opinion, again, there is a neglect of the fact that much of the work is done by administration. It is not only done by politics. Politics is exactly relevant because it gathers collective demand, it reshapes it, and it molds it into public action. But then politicians themselves cannot define without putting their hands in the dirt of practice, which they rarely do because they perform a different function in the system, to the level of secondary legislation, tertiary legislation, protocols, guidelines, and the management of funds that in a way give shape to all sorts of public action that we see on the ground. And that job of translating broad mandates into practice is done by civil servants. We rarely acknowledge that, but those are hugely politically relevant actors that we rarely involve in the public debate. And I don't think they should be politicized to the extreme where they just change every 5 years, very much as it happened, for example, with Donald Trump in the United States, because that's exactly the way to break our legs and make it impossible to foster thinking beyond the short-term political mandates. Civil servants are there, in my opinion, exactly to ensure continuity to public action, and to do so not irrespective, but beyond the political mandate of the turn, because there are things that unite us that is very important for us to cater for, even in the diversity of the views that we legitimately share. Civil servants are there, and in a way, we make that evident to the public, and we facilitate the interaction between civil servants in figuring out those solutions and the citizens themselves is another important means of democracy that I feel is largely neglected by the debate, mostly because it's usually focused on very interesting things such as citizen assemblies, mini publics, other means of deliberative and associative democracies that are important, but that do not necessarily tap in what happens beyond the moment we make a decision. And that beyond is very relevant, but we rarely understand it. So this was a lengthy answer, but it does provide some overview on what democracy mean or is not meaning, but could mean at all the levels of engagement, be it at the citizenship, the party level, or the level of government itself and its structures.
No, absolutely. And I think it makes perfect sense. And what you said earlier is that the governance structures that we set in place are somewhat unfit, be it to speed or be it to the administrative functions that stand behind. And I think the same is true for different systems we see in place, for our business systems, for our economic systems, for our food systems, for our education systems, and so forth. And I would be very interested, because what I hear from you, Iacopo, is that you say that on a broader scale, we do have a collective understanding what the most pressing challenges of society are right now. You, of course, mentioned climate change. We may or may not at some point also talk a little bit about immigration, maybe about data, artificial intelligence. I think there are quite a few challenges that are also not in the spotlight as we speak right now. But so I understand that we have somewhat a common understanding on the street to know which challenges we face. And if we talked about governance and those governments in place, again, different countries, do you see that parties and do you see that those structures are changing as well over the past 5 or 10, or you choose the time horizon span, or is that something where we still see a lot of reluctance?
Well, I would say that it's not an argument that I cherish a lot because it's kind of already heard many times, but Nordic European countries, be that because of their specific political culture or their small scale or their relative ethnic homogeneity, are relatively better placed, I would say, let's say, for example, with respect to Italy or other Southern European countries, to exactly address these problems. And the reason they do so is exactly because they also, partially by tradition, because of the specific trajectories of their public administration and their governments, but also because of their own political culture, as I was saying, they're relatively better able to exactly pinpoint those challenges and cater for them beyond the short term. This is, of course, something that I had the chance to notice in the first place by working in Helsinki or with Finnish people, including Finnish institutions. But it is very apparent also on the way they're usually better able to deliver, both in a strict economic terms, but also in terms of social inclusivity, in terms of their ability to address challenges such as climate change, or to shape the future of certain industrial sectors. We're seeing right now, for example, with green steel making in Sweden. So there are good examples in a way, which doesn't mean at all that we can basically draw on them to build better systems also in other countries. I would never advise any Italian MP or head of department in a public administration to follow the example of Finland, let's say, because those contexts do matter, and solutions cannot be just transplanted from another. They need to be carved out, and that's also where I believe, in a way, our work as in a way, researchers and consultants is exactly not only to sell best practices, but to get our hands dirty with those decision makers, with those societal stakeholders. They can also work in private companies and so forth, to exactly immerse ourselves into that specific perspective, into that societal context. Not only because that it provides you with a different purview on their challenges, their motivations, their incentives, and that's the only way that you have to basically make sure that they own whatever solution you might provide them with or co-create with them. But also because it is important to co-create those challenges. They cannot just be transplanted. And of course, this is very hard. And I feel it also entails a different way to look exactly at the interplay between theory and practice. Sometimes we in research are also leaning towards casting out these broader paradigms that originally are meant to show a few aspects of reality. New public management, for example, might be one of these ideas. Certainly, deemed to be out of touch, under-delivering with respect to to public services, out of control of political mandate, too rigid, was important in a way to draw upon methodologies, managerial practices, and budgeting frameworks that were drawn from the private sector to bring in more flexibility. But then implementing that paradigm as a whole, as if it was applicable to the whole of public administration in different countries, regardless of whether you are a developed country, a least developed country, was completely out of scale and out of context. And that generated disasters. That's how the countries that in a way didn't rely too much on that, or relied on that smartly by putting that into the right place, adapting that to their context, or in specific parts of their public administration where that was useful, were the ones that actually have been better off in dealing with the pandemic in the first place. But that's what happens when you come with a strong theoretical assumption about how humans behave in an organization and what's the way forward for them to deal with a certain challenge, and don't engage with the practice itself. And that's also an humbling act that I also try to keep in mind in my own work, certainly trying to analyze with a step back from practice, because that's exactly the power of research and theory. But at the same time, never forgetting that theory is not reality. Theory is the abstraction and the interpretation of reality from a very specific perspective that provides us with tools that we can use to adjust reality and to reform it for different purposes. But they should be used cum grano salis, if I can use Latin, and not fall extremely in love with them, because that's very dangerous, as new public management says.
Maybe we can use that to come back with the limitations of consulting, because what you talk to, I suppose, is one of the very challenges of consulting, that you come up with a hypothesis, you test it, it works, and then you apply it to market A or government B, or whichever C you can find, and then you try to reuse that framework. Is that in fact one of the limitations or dangers that we see with consulting, and what other components do come to mind? And you can either talk about the book or about your personal opinion on consulting and what's gone wrong with consulting in a way.
What use do you make of them? If they use them in a Tayloristic perspective. So basically, you produce the framework, you put it out, and then you apply it regardless of context in the very same way, because you have productified it. And that's the most cost-efficient way to manage resources within an organization, to just apply it in different contexts. That's completely mad. That's completely unpurposeful. It's not automatic that a framework developed in one specific context or just out of the blue, out of the tinkering be that done on slides, on doc, or on a meeting in a 30-floor skyscraper outside of the actual action on the ground that the framework is supposed to talk to, is actually capable of meeting the problem. First, because information on the ground is not leveraged. Second, because actors themselves are not empowered to own it, to interpret it in the first place. And that's dramatic, because then it seems like you have a very nice cookbook on how to do things, follow step 1, step 2, step 3, and that's not the case at all. I mean, you can do that, but it only very rarely works. It works for the sort of challenges that are very, again, Tayloristic, that can be in a way bureaucratized. But many of the things that our bureaucracies try to accomplish are actually not bureaucratic at all, especially when we are dealing with this sort of challenges. That's why contextualization is very important. And that's why, in a way, I'm not sure, I haven't worked myself into the consulting industry, and I don't want to be unfair towards that respect. Or I haven't worked the classic consulting industry, so the McKinsey, the Boston Consulting Group, the KPMG, and so on. But certainly the inability, in a way, of those consultants that have been embedded in political decision-making during the last 30 years haven't brought us so far, exactly in light of the things that we discussed before. And in a way, again, consulting can be a very powerful means of basically putting a mirror to public or private companies and enable them to reflect on their purpose, on their mandate, on how they do things. But this needs to be acknowledged. We are not just providing a product. I feel the difference. A metaphor that usually that I have come up with in the past is that we are not basically their policy designers. We are their psychologists. We are the psychiatrists, which basically brings you away from an idea where you just manufacture a nice product to providing a very specific and customized service to the person. And that doesn't happen if you're just accumulating projects and basically catering to delivery and budget regardless, and profit made out of it, regardless of the purpose that animates it. And that's one problem, which I don't know how far it's true in the case of consulting industry, but that should be put on the ground based on my opinions expressed before. Then, of course, there is the question of purpose in itself. What I like about Demos is that exactly because it is not founded by any specific home organization, it has a clear political agenda, societal agenda, political agenda. I would say that ultimately it is a political one, even if many of my colleagues maybe would not agree, that puts clear values and propositions on the table, and it tries to select projects based on the advancement of that agenda. That's how, in a way, the organization or a consulting organization can work in order to put certain objectives above profits, so to speak, which Demos Helsinki is doing because it is a not-profit organization. Then, again, I'm not against for-profit organization in consulting, just saying that, again, that provides you with a different sort of incentives. And I'm not an expert in how, in a way, the governance structure of consulting companies put purpose or profit on top of their own sensibility and thinking. But maybe that's something that the book by Mazzucato and Collington would do. So I strongly recommend that to be visited and read in that respect. Maybe to end up on that, there are two minor points which we already touched upon. Again, the fact that new public management was broadly adopted and narrowed down, reduced, even in terms of just the sheer workforce, our public administrations completely left off of any analytical capacity our governments, which means that if they want to do strategy, they basically have to systematically rely on external actors that don't have the same incentives of governmental actors to do that. Their incentives are most notably to make profit, which means that I'm not necessarily solving your problem, but if I can't solve your problem, there will be another project you can sell me to go one step deeper. I mean, and sometimes this makes sense because not all problems can be solved in just one shot. But it certainly creates a problem where the government has no critical self-reflection capacity within their structures to also analyze what is provided by the consultant. It provides you less of a co-creative capability to figure out how to contextualize that perspective into place. And it also deprives you of a way to critically self-assess whether that solution is actually fit or not for your context. And this is something that exactly, as I guess Mazzucato and Conlington point out, has happened massively due to public sector reform in the last 30 years. Yeah, maybe that should be it. I think I had another point, but it fell out of my head. And yeah, let's stop it.
No, and I think that makes very good sense. So thank you very much for elaborating that. A few things that came to mind is, I believe, also the power of consultancies of the industries and of the systems that we've created is that they are so nested or so embedded into each and every public and private sector decision makers. So if we actually can transform consulting, let's use this broader term, in a way that we may change those incentives and the purpose of such, I think it has a tremendous power as well that can then trickle down into public and private sectors. And
if I can just jump on that, that was exactly my last point. It is interesting to note how the private sector consulting industry is capable of attracting usually the best and the brightest, exactly due to their own salaries, career development pathways, and so forth, which is important. But again, what happens when the government is not able to do the same? That's another problem in the lack of capacity within government. How do we bring them collective good, for the common good? In most cases, governments can't just compete with those stakeholders. That at the same time, by pursuing slightly more profit-oriented incentives and providing the occasional support, the disengaged support that an external actor can do to those governments where public good is actually conceived, engineered, and put on the ground, which is quite paradoxical.
Thank you very much for that clarification, Iacopo. And I have a couple of questions, 3 in fact, that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. But before we go there, we talked about incentives, we talked about some structures that may need to be changed fairly fast, let's just call it. And we also talked about co-creation, and we've mentioned communication, we've mentioned collaboration. And I suppose that you are an artist yourself and that you are also interested in art. And maybe this is a factor that is underestimated many times. So I don't know if this is a dead end or if you have any thoughts if art can also play a role in all what we've discussed, which sounds rather dry with policy and schemes and frameworks and so forth. What role does art potentially play in the changes that we need to see coming?
I would say an absolutely critical one. I might just leave it there in the sense of like, how will exactly that happen? Besides saying blatant and commonsensical things about how art reflects tendencies of our societies or contributes to shape them by the multiplication and diffusion of memes in the most generic sense of the word that can be uptaken, used to mobilize or awaken different ways of looking at reality and so forth. Maybe one thing that I could, there are 2 things. Maybe the first thing concerns exactly the way I look at my job or at my jobs in research and consulting and how this has to do with art. I feel, and I'm increasingly supported by that by speaking with very interesting people in those sectors, that most of research and consulting in the end are about art in the sense of being artisan of something that is not necessarily standardized or perfectly replicable, but that needs in a way to pull over always continuously your creative resources out. Because again, there is no one size fits all solution for those challenges or for the distinct problems or questions that you might address or tackle in consulting or research. And that's exactly where art, in a more narrower sense of looking at things creatively from a different perspective, not relying on any preconceived playbook, is very, very important. It's certainly not about writing a song or drawing a painting and so forth, but it entails elements of the very same mindset and a certain openness of mind, curiosity, and courage as well, especially if you're using art in a way, but in a practice-led way, so in interaction with the real problems, that is very important to, in a way, get your head around those problems in the first place. So I don't repute myself an artist at all, but I do feel that, in a way, engaging with these practices helped me also look creatively at the world, because ultimately what we are trying to do, not necessarily myself, but us as organizations or systems of organization that are trying to challenge the existing structures, is to create new structures. And those structures are up to us to create. So we need to be creative by definition. That's where art plays a role. Art and craft, I might say, which then leads me exactly to the second point. This is not only something I believe for researchers, consultants, or artists. It's up for each and every one of us. I feel that a topic that is usually neglected in our debates, even in political debates, but that I think is most strongly expressed by Brazilian philosopher Roberto Unger, is that of imagination. And he says something very poetic, but I want to bring it about because I think it's relevant, that basically the history of politics or the history of society is internal to the history of the mind, which is kind of paradoxical because we are used to see ourselves as, in a way, immersed in the cage of existing institutions, political processes, things that are completely out of reach with us and that define still the world that we are living and where we feel powerless. But then, as also Steve Jobs once said, when you realize that the world is done by people that are not necessarily smarter than you, not because people are more or less smart, but because we can all, in a way, start to engage into learning, start to engage into exploring different ways to pursue our creativity that might not have to do with art strictly defined, but that are ultimately artistic. These are the ways that we have to recreate our own worlds, be them because we want to change one specific element in our lives, be that the professional trajectory or our hobbies, or be that because our structures in society, be them because of a local problem or a national challenge, a topic that mobilizes some profound chords of your own sensitivity, can be instruments that can be used for you and for everyone to engage with those problems creatively. And those possibilities are never deprived of us. And it feels a little bit patronizing to just state it out loud without proving it, because it's, of course, very challenging. And certainly, one also needs to find the structures that incentivizes exactly this approach to look at reality, this creativity. That's maybe where also traditional education would be much more important. Traditional education intended as primary or secondary. And we need much more of that, I believe, because that's ultimately what happens, what empowers exactly our own reckoning with creativity, our own sensitivity towards seizing it. And for me, that acknowledgement came exactly the moment I came at Demos, because relative to the Italian academia, that was the first place that truly told me, hey, we have this problem. None of us actually knows how to solve it, but we are just doing it together. You have this accountability for trying to solve it with us. Let's do our best. We can fail. We can learn. We are doing it together. Just be safe and trust your own creativity as well as your expertise and knowledge, because there's no other way we can try to solve this. And I guess that applies pretty much to many things in life. So
absolutely. Empowered co-creation. I really do like that, Iacopo. Thank you very much. And I think that links very nicely to the first of the final three questions for today's podcast episode anyways. And that is, what makes you hopeful?
Action. Usually we see hope as the result of action, but actually action is the result of hope. So even when I'm discouraged, I see hope in the things that I do. I see hope in the people that try to do it as well, even in a moment where everything in the general is discouraging towards that end. There's no other way than that. Because if we stop analyzing that is important, but just stopping and being stuck into paralysis can be quite disempowering. And we are not going to go through this if we are disempowered. We need ways to be empowered, and that requires action, I believe, and very general.
Purpose and action. And that brings us to the second question, and that, Iacopo, is who are your mentors and whom do you look up to personally?
Well, do I have to basically make names and surnames?
If names come to mind, you can bring names. If traits of people come to mind, you can also give traits. And if none of the like comes to mind, then that's also perfectly fine. I've heard very different answers here. You don't have to have names, but...
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah, I would say that I've had two sorts of mentors. There are ones that truly, in a way, empowered me to look critically at things in the way that I'm partially reporting in this podcast now. And those might have been within my academic career, within my professional career. And then there are those that empowered me to exactly trust myself in the ability that I could discover, even when I didn't trust to have it, to try to engage into action, regardless of what the outcome would have been, and even despite my own lack of confidence in it. And those were very important. Then luckily, there is a subsection, which is exactly the intersection of the two, which is exactly where a couple of people that come to mind really honed in on during the last few years. And I'm immensely grateful towards them, because even if it's up to each and every one of us in a way to become creative, or in a way try to take purposeful action, it ultimately boils down to people exactly showing you how this can be done in practice. And again, I feel meeting these people, this sort of people, can be quite transformative for one life. And so, yeah, that's exactly how I'll go with it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Iacopo. And the third and final question for today's episode is one which I call the 3 truths. And it's a fairly hypothetical question. And I would like you to imagine that you're traveling in space all by yourself for actually quite some time. So it could be a couple of months, and it could be even a couple of years. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species, and they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
So 3 questions, basically.
3 facts or 3 truths about humanity. It can also be questions.
Well, I would go for the 3 questions. And the first one will be, what's your purpose? The second one will be, it's very hard for me to come up with that, but what's your favorite artist? The third one will be, what do you love?
Purpose, art, and love. I very much like that, Iacopo. And with that, thank you so much for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast. And if you have any final words or final message for the audience today, it's all yours.
No, my message is to you. I think it's a privilege to be hosted in your podcast. I'm very much enlightened also by our own conversations that we had, and thankful for you setting up the stage to have not only this conversation, but a meaningful conversation, or I would say purposeful conversations, or what is it that drives ourselves as we meander through the structures and systems that shape us, but that we can also continuously reshape as we see fit, or try to do so creatively.
Iacopo, thank you for being part of that.
Thank you.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Do more of what makes you happy.
Be yourself. Positive. Just another mindset. Be positive.
Do more of what makes you happy.